And in Sri Lanka, we were discussing and various things on the media and TV and the print and other media on our Sri Lankan COVID control and etc. Now we are facing today now increasing deaths every day, roughly about 4 to 5 deaths, and the diagnosing at least 200 to 300, even to 500 patients daily. And most of thing what we told even that time, the last first symposium, the wearing of mask and the importance of the respiratory infection, the droplet infection was not considered as important in that time of the country. Now people are realized that I'm very happy that everyone is wearing mask in the society, which I told at the January 28th of this year. So it's the importance of the respiratory droplet and the infection and the control and etc. Now anyway, another thing is because of the world is globally as well as locally, this is going on the pandemic proportion in the world, and we are going on the epidemic and going for we may be heading for disaster in coming months, and we all as a health personnel, so they have a very clear understanding about the current knowledge about the COVID, about the diagnosis, new modalities, different clinical syndromes associated with COVID. This is quite different from the other viral infection, and the various new treatment strategies which were considered as very important at the beginning. Now almost they are ruled out. The new daily new information are uh, adding into the existing knowledge, and that is as a responsible organization of a Central Sri Lanka as KSM, Cancer Society of Medicine. I thought to have this symposium to update the recent knowledge with the experts. They will do the needful, and to particularly the doctors need to update this knowledge. That is why we thought to organize this symposium on COVID-19. Today we have three experts addressing the diagnosis and the virology, and then the clinical syndromes as well as the latest management strategies. So the first lecture is going to our consultant virologist, Rohit Mutugala. Rohit is going to talk about the diagnosis COVID-19 and what is new. And we will have a question time at the end of the symposia. After three lectures, we will have a discussion and questions. So I'm inviting Dr. Rohika to start his presentation. And this will be telecast online to the other hospitals, Peradina, Sirmaga, and other hospitals. And this link is available, and everyone is going to benefit this one.
Good morning to everybody. Thank you very much, Dr. Madhagadara, for your kind introduction and inviting me for this symposium. I think maybe we did same kind of a symposium on around March and April, right? So the what I discussed on that time, now some of them has changed completely. I think one thing is those days was WHO, even our health ministry is not recommending the mask, but now we have to recommend that one. Those kind of things has changed. So I think this is history now. I think you all can remember what's happened. This is now almost 1 year ago. It started in China, Wuhan province, Wuhan city, and it's become pandemic. And this is what the situation in today morning, as correctly mentioned, almost uh, it's getting gradually increasing every day. So I was again give you a little bit on virology. This is another coronavirus. It's a large envelope virus, and it has a wide host range. That's why we acquired this infection from the other animals. And there are many coronaviruses. So I think you can remember there are some other human coronaviruses like OC43, NL63. I think these viruses, they are coming up. These viruses also may appear like a pandemic or outbreaks in the past, and it become a seasonal or community virus. So I think SARS-CoV-2, this coronavirus is going to be like that. Maybe we have to live with this virus unless we get a 100% efficacy vaccine. So before going to the diagnosis, I will explain the principles how to apply these diagnostic tests. Usually after viral infection, after usually 1 week, 1 to 2 weeks of viral infection, then the virus start to multiply. So the viral RNA in the respiratory secretions appear usually three days before onset of symptoms. Then this will last up to 5 to 6 days, but some patients it will go up to 84 to 90 days even. Because that this PCR is very sensitive test. So the PCR can detect even one copy of RNA. So maybe the latter part of the infection, we are detecting the dead viral particles and the remaining of RNA. That's why most patients are even positive after months of acute infection. Then the antigen, usually antigen is appear a couple of days before of the onset of symptoms, and it will last around 1 week. Because antigen detection, you need active viral multiplication. I will talk that one during our the antigen detection test. So usually antigen is positive within first 7 days of the infection. And then the antibody response will appear. Then the IgG and IgM antibodies usually appear around day 5 to day 7. IgG will last maybe 3 to 4 months. Now it's too early to tell how long this will last because these are new tests. But the IgM response is short living. So IgM cannot be used for the diagnosis. Usually IgG can be used to diagnose the past infection. So this is the basis of the natural history of the infection. We can apply different kind of tests. So if you want to detect patients in the infectious period, we have to go for a RNA detection, that's by the PCR, or antigen detection to detect infectious period. If you go for a detect a past infection, you can go for a antibody testing, or sometimes PCR also may be positive in these patients because the remaining dead viral particles are in the secretions. So laboratory diagnosis, now we usually, the main method of diagnosis is by the PCR, that's real-time PCR. We consider it as a gold standard. Then we can do the viral isolation, but it's rarely practiced because it needs safety level 3 practices, which is very difficult to find at this moment. And then newly introduced antigen detection test and the antibody detection. So going to the PCR, usually this PCR now currently we do by the real-time RT-PCR. It's a very widely used and considered as a gold standard test. It can be performed in a routine biosafety level 2 laboratory with personal protective equipment. So sensitivity is vary. It's around 60 to 90%. If it is in the upper respiratory tract, sensitivity is high, around 80 to 90%. But in the lower respiratory tract, sensitivity is around 60 to 70%. It's very low. But specificity is almost above 99%. This real-time PCR detect viral RNA. So we can get some idea about how infectious this patient is. I think most people now wondering this, telling that CT values. We say that sometimes this is the graph what we getting at the end. So if it is patient has high viral load, its graph appears early. The CT value is low. Like some patients now these days we are getting 14, 15, even some of them less than 10. So if it is latter phase of the infection, the CT values, the positivity appear is very late, around 35, 38 like that. So that is the relationship between CT value and the viral load. So some people having high viral load, that they are in the active infection. Some has low viral load, maybe they are a resolving infection. But this is not always applicable because due to sample collection errors, sometimes high infectious patient can get a low viral load because the sample do not contain adequate number of viruses. But this can be used as a guide when this patient is in an early phase of the illness or in the latter phase of the illness. Because sometimes we get today husband is positive, following day, then they do the contact tracing, the wife is positive. So sometimes husband has the other way around, wife he later detected might have a low viral load and husband has a high viral load. So then the epidemiological people can pin out where this infection is came from. But this is not always true because of the sampling error. It can give some wrong results, but we can get a clue. Other thing is with this major drawback of this PCR is we can detect these RNA fragments with dead viruses. Like previously, before discharge, we have to do two PCRs. That should be two consecutive PCRs, which never happens for most of the patients. I can remember one patient in Valikanda got positive up to 84 days because they excrete these dead viral particles for a long time. Those are non-infectious. Now, according to our famous professor, Professor Malik Piris, he's telling that after 7 days, patient can consider as a non-infectious. But in Sri Lanka, as a precaution, we keep it up to 14 days. They discharge. After 14 days, patients are rarely infectious. But it's rarely, there's a theoretical possibility that 5 to 6% can even excrete live virus. So that's why even after this discharge of 14 days, they have to go for another 14 days self quarantine at home. So PCR has its own problem. It's a time consuming test. Usually, results will appear around 4 to 5 hours later when they start processing samples. And it has to be done with a batch test. We do not have random access. Like if we start first 96 samples, after first 10 minutes, we can't enter anything into that run. We have to finish that 96, then we have to take another 96. That's a major problem. We don't have random access. And this one need expertise, usually training in the PCR testing, as well as in this case with biosafety and biosecurity. Because everybody in the lab, when they're handling the sample, when they remove RNA from the sample, they have to wear personal protective equipment inside the biosafety cabinet. So this is class 2 plus practices. They have to wear full PEP when they're handling the sample till it becomes non-infectious stage. And this contamination is a big problem. Sometimes it can give false positives. In Sri Lanka, I think we are more worried about false positives than false negatives. Maybe false negatives is creating the problem to the community, but here we are worried about false positives because if you are handling large number of samples, then your capacity, you can get false positives due to a technical errors, due to contamination. Because if you are handling one high positive sample, it can some of the secretions or some droplet can jump into another negative sample and both can get positive results. That's why I think all this news about false positives in private labs and certain labs. Then it's costly. Cost is around 4,000 to 6,000 per sample. This is only the reagent cost, not paying the electricity or the laboratory staff salaries or the machine problems, those things. But as a solution, now there are rapid methods also coming up. One is this lamp method. You no need to do a PCR machine. You can run in a water bath also. And other thing is the chest. People know this gene expert machine. With limited capacity, you can get the results within 45 minutes. But the problem is supply for these gene expert machines are very limited. Even Sri Lanka received only 4,000 reagents. Actually, Candy, I was able to get 200 at least. Now we are trying to do it. then your results will be available for within 45 minutes, but we have to select the samples, otherwise that 200 will be finished very soon. So maybe we can use this one for a like sudden ICU admission, so there was kind of a situation. Then this new modality, the people are always talking about this one, is the antigen detection kit. Antigen used very recently WHO has approved two kits, two immunochromatographic, that means ICT kits for detection of SARS-CoV coronavirus antigen. It's detect viral antigen. But the main difference between PCR and the antigen test is in PCR there is an amplification step. Well, I go back to this one. If you have one RNA molecule, if you do PCR, at the end it's become millions. So obviously sensitivity will be increased. But the antigen test, if you have a couple of antigens, even if you do the testing, the same number. So sensitivity is obviously less compared to PCR. The sensitivity the manufacturer says is around 90% compared to PCR when this CT value, that's a viral load, is less than 32. That means when the patient is in an infectious period, usually we consider CT value above 32 is non-infectious. So when the patient is in infectious period, the manufacturer claims this can detect around 90% compared to PCR. So less than 10, but our local validation, it varies around 70 to 85%. So compared to PCR, we can miss 10 to 15%. It's all depend on what is the transmission level in the country. If it is a low level of transmission in the country, you can't take that 10%. Maybe a couple of months ago, each and every case is very important. But now it is in the community, so maybe you can take that 10% chance. Because otherwise, PCR is a cumbersome test. Then it will be locked back. There's a huge number of backlogs in the laboratory. Couple of months ago, one day was 13,000 was remaining in a one night. So then the results will be available maybe in 3 to 4 days. So the public health action is delayed. In that case, maybe 10% chance we can accept. Depending on the what is the situation of the ground level, what is the transmission level in the country. I think you may be agreed with me. With the current situation, we can take that 10% chance. If it is remaining 70 to 85 to 90%. If it is a very low sensitive test, I don't think it has any benefit. So this can be detect the patient during their infectious period. So if it is viral load is low during the infectious period, antigen test can be low. But in a latter part of the infection, antigen test cannot be utilized. It will be negative. And the results will be available within 20 minutes. It can be used as a point of care. Person who take the sample, nasopharyngeal swab, you can do the testing at the same place. And results will be available in 20 minutes. And you can go for an individual test. You can do a one patient, maybe next patient comes, we can start on that patient as well. Not like PCR. It's not a batch test. And you need only minimum facilities and minimum training. Even everybody in this lab, after seeing a video, you can do that one with personal protective equipment. No need of any equipment. But the problem is sensitivity. So we have to, as a country, we have to decide to whom we are going to do this test. For a clinical patients, for a screening before the surgery, or detecting first contacts, or a random testing. I think country has to put a guideline. Still the guidelines are on draft level because so many people putting so many ideas. Every day it's changing. So at the moment, what we have decided is not for this one used for a clinical patient. Because one thing is, in a clinical patient, anyway, patient is in the latter part of the infection, maybe. I think sir will agree because even in a pneumonia, patient comes in maybe in after day 5 or day 6. So at that time, viral load is very low. So antigen test, we can miss it. For clinical patients, symptomatic patients, antigen test may not be useful, especially after day 5 with the complication. But initial phase with the sore throat, maybe runny nose with first symptoms, it will be useful. Other thing is we can go for a first contact tracing. We can use it. Postmortems, it's a bit of a doubtful. It's not recommended by the manufacturer even because people die because of the complications. So then the time is already passed. They don't die within first 2 days. So after day 5 or day 6, this test has no value. So other thing, we can do it in a community screening, but if the prevalence is low in the community, we might not able to catch up most cases using this rapid test. So I think all epidemiologists, virologists, then the clinicians and everybody has to come up with a proper guideline to use this rapid test, to whom we are going to use this one, what situation we are going to use this one. And even this one is not a substitute for PCR because of the sensitivity issue. But time, the cost and everything will be less. And the accessibility even less. Now, only very few PCR doing laboratories in the country. So even a base hospital, even the field, any place, we can do this. Currently, Sri Lanka, the NMRA has given approval for 2 kits. Both 2 kits are approved by the WHO. The WHO says if they can detect 80% of the PCR positive cases, they will give the approval. So those 2 kits were NMRA was approved, and we did one validation for a 1 kit, but we received another lot. So we are now doing a validation for the other kit as well. So then the other modalities, antibody detection, as you are aware, and IgM response is very poor. So we have to go for a IgG detection or IgM IgG combined detection. There are many laboratory methods. You can use ELISAs or immunochromatographic or this hormone analyzer machines. But only thing is it detect only the past infection, no patients who are recovering from the infection. Usually antibody response appear after day 7 of the infection. It's peak around day 10. It will last around 3 to 4 months, but we never know how long it will last and it will give the protective immunity. And also another problem is only 60 to 70% patients will give the immune response. If patient is having just a mild upper respiratory tract infection, the chance of getting immune response is less. Asymptomatic patients even less. So this antibody detection test is not suitable for detection of acute infectious patients. So it can be used as a zero surveillance. How many infected in the community? Or other thing is now we are using as a discharge criteria. Or sometimes we have a problem like penny testing, patients giving low viral load. So we need to know who is the focus is. Then we can go for an antibody testing. Even sometimes some labs say that false positive results, when you go for antibody testing, we can sort out those kind of a problem. So I will give you another just to brief outline on sample collection and transport. I have done this one previously as well, but we have getting so many problems with the sample problem. The samples for PCR is you can collect nasopharyngeal swabs, nasopharyngeal aspirates, ET secretions, then the induced sputum and the postmortem lung biopsy. One in Sri Lanka, the epidemiological unit is recommended nasopharyngeal swab and the oropharyngeal swabs in a one container to give the chance of very high. Now we are using this viral transport medium as well as this nucleic acid stabilizing medium to transport this one. And collection of these samples considered as an aerosol generating procedure. So personal protective equipment is a must when you are collecting the sample. Then you have to collect it into a viral transport medium. Then you have to transport with ice as soon as possible into the laboratory. If you find any delay, you can keep it this one in the your refrigerator. But please do not freeze it, not put it into the deep freezer. And you have to transport this one in a triple package system. I will let you again now. So the sample has to be collected from the nasopharynx because this virus is infecting the columnar epithelial cells, not the squamous cells in the upper part. So you have to take the samples from the nasopharynx. If you take from the anterior part, the squamous cells will come and test will be negative. So sample has to be collected from the nasopharynx. Then you have to pack it in a triple package because still we consider this one as a high risk pathogen. First, you have to put this one into a polythene bag, then put it into a plastic container, then lid should be tight, then you can put it into another container. I think these all instructions we have given to the hospital wards, but unfortunately, we have seen some lot of drawbacks because sample tube need to be labeled with patient details. Every day, for our laboratory, we are getting 5 or 6 samples without label. So it's really difficult because we take it out everything from the primer package. If there is a 2 tubes without labels, we can't say which one is which one because we take it out from the outer package because sometimes they forgot to label in that tube, but the outer package is labeled, but we take it out now, then it's very difficult. We have to find it, even impossible. The other thing is it should be tightly closed because otherwise this will be leaked when you are transporting to the laboratory. The cap of the tube, this one, should be very tightly closed. Otherwise, everything, the media will be in the outside. In the outer container, we recommended to label with the hospital name in full, then the ward and the number of samples. Because there are so many packages. Now we have to give some priorities. So we have to find the correct one. Finding this package will take long time. And sometimes we don't know what is inside. That's why we ask to write hospital name in full because most of the time, sometimes even 3 to 4 per day, we don't have a hospital. So it's very difficult to give the report on those things. Then the ward number and the number of samples inside because till the our package is open, we don't know how much inside. That is the problem. The other thing is request form. We need details, at least contact history or whether it's a highly suspicious one. Because we are now doing large number of samples, so we do some considerable number of samples of pooling. So if one pool is positive, that means we do 3 samples into one together. We do the testing. If one pool is positive, we do it again. So another 4 hours. If you give a correct history, whether this is highly suspicious, if has a first contact, we never pool that one. Then we get the report early. And request forms has to be sent separately because sometimes we see the request forms come through inside the triple package. Then it will be difficult to find who is the sample is. And this is the problem we are facing because we are getting so many packages. So we never know what is inside that one. Because sometimes we get 500 samples, we can do only 400. So we have to give the priority. So how we can find what is inside without a label outside. This is good one because they have put a label inside, outside. So we know what is inside. Otherwise, our poor laboratory people has to find this one more than ours because they can have to open these packages and see what is inside. It's a real difficult. And sometimes we get these short forms. THK. I think somebody has wrong this one for NHK, they are right. But we have another 2 THKs that Kurunegala and Kuliyapitiya sending the sample. So how we send this report to where we can send? That is a problem. That's why I need support from you all to please adhere what is guideline we have given because otherwise it will be unnecessary delay for generating the reports because this finding out these things are very difficult. So sample collection for rapid immunochromatographic test, we have to same as PCR, you have to take from the nasopharyngeal swab, but the thing is, it has to be collected by the tube given by the manufacturer. we can't use the same tube for the PCR testing. So if you do this test collected, it has to be done within 1 to 2 hours. So I think the person who collect the test, the place who collect the sample has to done the test, because otherwise the PCR medium cannot be used for the antigen testing. And same thing, you have to wear personal protective equipment when you collect the test and doing the test, and proper waste management. You have to discard the swab and this content. But no need of equipment, no need of biosafety cabinet. You can do it even in here. So antibody test, we can do 3 to 5 ml of venous blood. Usually we prefer clotted blood, but please remember this blood also we considered as a potentially infectious. So it should come in a specialized packing, at least in a Ziploc bag. Because sometimes what we happen is, now we saw the package in the PCR lab, same name for a COVID testing, and when I go to the serology lab, I see the tube in the for a dengue, same patient. So the dengue blood also should come in a Ziploc bag because the patient is suspecting COVID. We never know, no. That is the problem. Then for a blood samples, you can keep up to refrigerator for 48 hours and you can send to the laboratory. So that's all I think I have to tell you. So thank you very much. And also I would like to thank our laboratory staff as well, because they are doing a hard job, because our capacity is 150 samples per day, but now they are doing 400 to 500 samples per day since October. So it's a very difficult job, because morning they have to go through all this tube marking, then they have to find the thing. They have to wear PP from 8 o'clock to 4 o'clock, same group, and they have to do the reading and reporting as well. Thank you very much.
So I think thank you very much on behalf of the KSM and all the participants, not only here, even the lecture solution, but several other places in this region. And actually, it is really helpful to even all of us who's updating the recent knowledge and a clear explanation to understand this. And the other thing is actually, as a government servant, I think this current month, the consultant virologists and their team are the one of the government group of governments that are working, I think, the most of their time, and most of us have less work because of the corona. And so I must thank all of us for coming and agreeing to have a lecture, as well as to, this is the second time, my request, as well as helping us to update our doctors. Thank you very much again. Now we will move into the second lecture, the clinical syndromes and associated with the COVID-19, our coronavirus, which is ever changing. As we thought at the beginning, the year before, and now a year later, things are changing over the months. It's very important to understand the clinical spectrum and the different presentation and the different behavior of this particular virus is quite different from other viral infection. So this lecture will be given by another expert, Dr. Duminda Asaratna, the consultant respiratory physician and the senior lecturer attached to the Faculty of Medicine, Department of Medicine. Duminda is going to talk us on the clinical syndrome and the update on novel coronavirus.
Thank you, sir, for the introduction and also for the invitation to do this presentation. And also thanks to the KSM team for organizing this timely symposium. I'm going to discuss about the clinical spectrum of COVID. As already was discussed, there have been 60 million deaths worldwide, mainly in the US, Mexico, Brazil, and India. But this was by October this year. However, if you look at the case fatality rates, you can see that it's mostly below 5 in several regions, and as globally, it's around 2.5%. So that's some good news, which is much less than some of the other recent pandemics we had. This is some early data which was published in March. This data from China. Uh, they have analyzed the symptomatology of COVID patients. This top one is for all these patients are with severe pneumonia who needed ICU admission. The top is the survivors, and here the patients who have died. So you can see up to about day 12 here, the symptomatology is same. So it's very difficult to see which patient is now even first week. They are fever and cough, then at identical time they develop respiratory symptoms, and then until they required ICU admission, that is also only very slight difference. So it was like a similar clinical picture. So it's very important. Even now, nowadays, it's not easy to identify which patient is going to get complications quite early in the disease. But as we know, about 80 to 85% of patients would be asymptomatic or mild symptomatic. Then there would be about 10 to 15% of patients who develop severe symptoms, and out of that, less than 5% would have major complications and would ultimately succumb to the illness. So this is the clinical severity that we have observed during the last period. So what about the symptoms? Usually, the commonest symptoms are fever, cough, dry cough, and shortness of breath, and also fatigue. Then there are less common symptoms. You can see headache, loss of taste and smell, nasal congestion, sore throat. Then sometimes they can have a productive cough. Then aches and pains. Interestingly, we are now seeing a lot of now these are some early findings, but as we go on, we know that a lot of patients with GI symptoms. So nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea has been very common in the last during the recent past. Now here the next on the right hand side, you can also see the symptomatology of most of the patients who have fatigue, breathlessness, cough, and also they have a lot of GI symptoms. And the red ones, they are the other side of the other half of the graph. That is the post-COVID period. During the follow-up, what were the symptoms? So it took a quite bit of time for these patients to improve from these settings. So these are the problems that we might be encountering in the future. So post-COVID syndromes, like post-viral syndromes. So there will be patients with breathlessness. So we'll be discussing these things, and also with joints and aches and pains. So these patients also will need some assessment in the future. What about the clinical spectrum? So the national guidelines of most countries adopt these 5 categories in assessing the clinical symptomatology of these patients or categorizing these patients, namely asymptomatic, who would have no clinical symptoms but with positive PCR, and chest X-ray done would be normal, and the examination findings also would be normal. The mild illness is fever, sore throat, and dry cough, and also body aches and pains, and with abdominal symptoms, GI symptoms. Again, the respiratory examination would be normal. They do not have pneumonia. So X-ray would also be normal if it's done. Then you get the moderate category, where they get early features of pneumonia or lower respiratory infections. So they will be having cough, and on examination they might have some crackles, and also chest X-ray, as you can see, will show some early basal changes. Then you get, but that category, the saturation would be normal, more than 94. So severe illness. Severe illness with that is those are the patients with pneumonia with a low saturation. Then you get the critical state where the patients develop complications like ARDS, shock and coagulation defects, encephalopathy, heart failure, and kidney disease. So these are the 5 categories that most countries use in their national guidelines, and I think we also have adopted a similar system. However, this was published only last week by WHO, called Living Guidelines. For therapeutic, for a trial, treatment trial purposes, they have simplified that classification. So they go for non-severe, severe, and critical. So all these asymptomatic, mild, and moderate, they have grouped together as moderate, because usually these patients do not require specific antiviral treatment. So for research purposes and for clinical trials, so they have adopted a much less complicated or much simplified criteria. So here again, the severity, although they have mentioned it's 90%, they have specifically mentioned that this is very individualized. So sometimes patients, even less than 92%, you might have to take it as severe depending on the other criteria. So if they rate more than 30, and then we'll go through the next slide, which is in more detail. So critical is again patients who need life-sustaining treatment because of the complications. So here you can see the critical COVID is defined by the criteria for ARDS, sepsis, septic shock, or other conditions that would normally require the provision of life support treatment. Whereas in severe COVID, they will have low saturation, maybe 90 to 92, respiratory rate. So depending on the age, they have given the cutoffs, and also other signs of dyspnea or respiratory distress, like excessive use of accessory muscles, inability to complete full sentence, or those clinical criteria. So if the patient does not have any of the above, they are non-severe disease. So that would be asymptomatic, mild, or moderate. What about our local guidelines? So we also have a similar system. This is actually from the guidelines for uh, intermediate centers, which patients should be in intermediate centers. So asymptomatic and mild patients should be in intermediate centers, because still our practice is all patients with COVID positive we institutionalize. But we have seen in other countries like in Europe, the patients with asymptomatic and mild disease, they were monitored at home. They were basically at home. Only moderate patients were admitted to the hospital. But here we institutionalize, and also uh, in addition to the symptomatology, they have also given some of the comorbidities, because considering the risk of the patient to develop severe illnesses. So these patients should go to the level 2 care, which we will discuss in a while. So moderate patients again to level 2 care here. So we will discuss what are the specific criteria for each of these things. So we have gone with the asymptomatic, mild, moderate, severe, and then there's another category for immunocompromised patients who also should be in more advanced treatment centers. So this is what the guidelines say. Level 1 is the intermediate centers. Then level 2 is like our Teldenia or base hospitals. Level 2 centers. Then level 3 is the national centers, which is national which is at Mulleria or at Angoda. So here you can see these are the patient categories that should go to these specific institutes. What about the complications that these patients might develop? So commonly seen complications are acute respiratory distress syndrome and respiratory failure, so pulmonary manifestations. Then they get sepsis, DIC, liver and kidney injury, pulmonary embolism, and also not mentioned here, but cardiac risk factors. As we have seen during the last few days, there can be a lot of cardiac complications. Then the rare ones would be rhabdomyolysis, uh, multisystem inflammation, and then pancreatitis and the other things mentioned here. Not only that, you can see there are a lot of neurologic manifestations that can occur, including headache, dizziness, and also encephalopathy, COVID encephalopathy, and also Guillain-Barré syndrome, and sometimes even strokes. Renal complications like asymptomatic elevation of creatinine, then acute kidney injury, proteinuria and hematuria can be very common, especially in patients who are critically ill. So also there are patients can develop liver problems, asymptomatic elevation of transaminases and bilirubins, and also including fulminant hepatitis, as we have seen recently there have been, I think, one patient who had died with fulminant hepatitis in Colombo. So GI manifestations has been quite common, including refractory diarrheas and thromboembolism, which has not been discovered few months back, which is quite new. Now there's a lot of talk about thromboembolism, like even macroangiopathy and microangiopathy. So there can be DVT, pulmonary embolisms. So cardiac complications, yes, even ischemic heart diseases, then cardiomyopathy, stress cardiomyopathy, uh, myocarditis, so a lot of cardiac manifestations and arrhythmias, and also like hypoglycemias and exacerbation of diabetic conditions and skin manifestations. So there can be a whole array of complications developing in these patients. We'll quickly discuss about the pathophysiology. What happens? So this SARS coronavirus, it gets attached to the nasal epithelium via the uh, angiotensin converting enzyme 2. So that enzyme, that is the port of entry to the viral to the cell to the for the viral particle. Then it can replicate inside the nasal mucosa. So in most patients, in about 80% of patients, that would be the end of story. So they will develop good immunity and they will contain the infection, and they will become, after about 2 weeks, they will recover from the infection. But there will be 10 to 15% of patients in whom there will be involvement of lower respiratory tract, lower respiratory tract, and migration of the virus into the uh, lung epithelium, where it infects the type 2 alveolar epithelial cells, again via the same receptor, same enzyme. What happens once it involves the lung epithelium or the alveolar uh, cells? You can see there can be viral replication in the lower respiratory tract, and then there can be lung damage, and also the inflammation. It will release a lot of cytokines, which is called the cytokines storm. So that includes interleukins, you can see here, TNF, interferons, all these GCSF, and there have been a lot of studies and a lot of research done on these things. And the cytokine storm has been well established in the recently. So that is the stage the patients go into severe disease. And then that triggers the full inflammatory cascade, and there will be a lot of inflammatory cells come in and host defense, and also, and that ultimately involves the lung damage with diffuse alveolar hemorrhages, alveolar damage, and ARDS picture. So that is the basically pathophysiology if you consider the lung. So same thing in a more illustrated manner, you can see here. So the coronavirus enters, at the port of entry is the enzyme here is here. Then it activates the T cell and the whole cascade of the inflammatory cells, and then there's the cytokine storm here. And so these are the specific pathological entities that happen: the coagulation disorders, the coagulopathy, then microcirculation, microangiopathy, the systemic inflammatory response, apoptosis, and also tissue cell damage. And then the main four systems involved are mentioned here: the lungs, heart, kidneys, and the brain, so neurology. So those are the main four systems. So in this, the next few slides, I will be mainly discussing about the lungs and the heart, and also I'll just touch upon these two as well. So these patients who develop severe diseases, people have tried to predict which patients will go like with have major complications and who might die at the end of the period. So what out of many parameters or many investigations they have checked, these are the four main investigations: cardiac troponin, myoglobin, CRP, and interleukin 6, which has shown a poor prognostic, which prediction as a poor prognostic markers. So this is not very early in the disease, but once they develop the cytokine storm and towards the early second week, if you do these tests, you might be able to catch up the patients who might go into severe complications. What are other investigations that we do? You can see here LDH and CRP, ferritin. Those are all inflammatory markers would be increased. Might not be very specific, so but you might be able to predict which patients might have a poorer disease course. then cardiac troponin, then the specific system-specific investigations are here, then D-dimers and prothrombin time. So again, once the patients go into these thrombotic manifestations, we can do and to identify the patients who are going to have these thrombotic manifestations. Procalcitonin to identify whether the patients are going to have secondary infection. That's a very common disease and a very poor prognostic feature to have secondary bacterial infection. So that the prothrombin infection is important. CRP can be elevated even in viremia. So that does not necessarily mean there's a bacterial superinfection. But even during cytokine storm and severe inflammation and viremia, you can get a high CRP. Multisystem inflammation is an important component in the pathophysiology. Here you can see the patients will have all these features of systemic or generalized inflammation, like conjunctivitis, all the mucosa, erythematous, the lymph nodes are there, skin rashes, and then all the system-specific features. So not only in adults, so COVID during the first part of the illness, it was even now we say it is less common in children, but then there have been few deaths, especially in the West and US, and they were talking about this Kawasaki-like illness, which is actually named multisystem inflammatory syndrome in children. So that is again the patients who are going to have this cytokine storm, the kids. So they will also have these Kawasaki-like features, or the mucocutaneous erythema, then lymph nodes and high temperature, and this can be fatal, and there have been few deaths as well. So this coagulopathy has been recently discovered as playing a very important role in the pathogenesis in the severe form of COVID. So just to mention what is happening, you can see here. So again, the cytokine storm, all these inflammatory markers can cause local and systemic inflammation, and ultimately can cause hypercoagulability and also angiopathy, right? Which can, so if it is large vessels, they cause thrombosis, venous and arterial thrombosis, macroangiopathy or macrothrombosis. If it is small vessels, call it microangiopathy, that will cause damage to the all cells, including acute tubular necrosis, or ARDS, and acute liver damage. So this plays a very important role in the pathogenesis of severe form of the COVID. Again, the same thing, and when it coupled with hypoxia and hypotension in sepsis, that more aggravates the clinical scenarios. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about the COVID pneumonia. So we have now discussed about the pathophysiology and basically the symptomatology of these patients and what are the complications they can develop. So as we have seen during the recent past, COVID pneumonia has been one of the major complications, fatal complications in these patients, and that has been there worldwide. So respiratory involvement can be asymptomatic to just upper respiratory infection, or it could be a atypical or a viral pattern of pneumonia, or it could involve respiratory failure and ARDS, and sometimes it can be vascular, like venous thromboembolism and pulmonary embolism. So it is a range of diseases. So the patients who have been more affected in US were older and individuals of Black, Asian, and minority ethnicity, and with comorbidities such as obesity, hypertension, and diabetes. So if you can remember that our Sri Lankan guidelines also, they said the patients with severe obesity should be in a second level care, because that is also considered the high risk category for COVID complications. So mortality risk can be high. Sorry about this thing. So this says it can go up to about 26 to 32%. One in UK, those are the patients with moderate to severe pneumonia. So the risk of the mortality rate was quite high. Even 1 out of 4 patients have died in certain centers. So just to have a look at their imaging, the chest X-ray, the moderate pneumonia, they might show these alveolar opacities compatible with viral pneumonia. The CT would HRCT would show again air bronchogram with this confluent air space consolidation. This is a little late during the second week. You can see on top of the consolidation, patient is developing a little bit of bronchiectasis. There is dilated bronchi, so that is an early feature that the patient is going to do. Patient is developing some interstitial lung disease. So there is alveolitis is establishing. The crazy paving appearance is again a very well described pattern in many conditions, including viral pneumonias, where there is this brown glass and also septal thickening, which means that there's alveolar plus interstitial involvement. Then you get ARDS, the typical picture of ARDS, and at late phase, you might get this organizing pneumonia pattern as a post-viral complication. There was a lot of talk about these two types of lung diseases, the clinical syndromes, the type 1 and type 2 or LNH type. At the beginnings, like when we were starting to see these patients. So L type is that because these patients become hypoxic and some patients are quite well. They don't have any symptoms, but if you check the saturation, that's very low. That was called happy hypoxia. And those patients were categorized as this L type, who were clinically well, and also symptoms were also very less, but were having low saturation. And if you do the PF ratio, which is below 100, so the PF ratio should be more than 300 in a normal patient. If it is below 300, that is early ARDS. 200 is moderate, and less than 100 is severe. So they fulfill the criteria for severe ARDS, but clinically they were well. So that was categorized as L type, and then later, then the other type, the patients who were very symptomatic and who needed even intubation, who needed acute respiratory care, they were the H type, low and high types. So there were different categories and different clinical picture, and also different ventilatory strategies or the treatment strategies for these patients. So I will quickly go through these two slides about L type. So theoretically, they had low elasticity and low VQ ratios and low lung recruitability, whereas high type had the opposite features. I'm not going to go into detail, but now it's more rather than two distinct entities. It is now identified or understood that this is a spectrum of the disease with a similar pathophysiology, where you see a very different range of presentation. These are the CTs that were done in early in the first week, and some patients had opacities, mild opacities. Then so the spectrum of diseases with different clinical situations. So it is now rather than L and H types. Now they say now it's more of a spectrum of disease with different presentations. But that type that two clinical syndromes are still useful when you decide on the management of these patients, especially the intensive care management of these patients. So what are our local criteria for admissions for the level 3 or the severe pneumonia? So these are the criteria for severe pneumonias. The patients are having worsening symptoms with clinical respiratory rate more than 20 and heart rate more than 100 with a respiration lower than 94. We consider them as severe. And these are the patients who are critical and who need ICU or HDU care. Again, saturation is below 92, PF ratio less than 300. You can see the rest of the parameters here. Just going back to a little bit to the history. So Spanish flu, now it's 1 century back, so almost 100 years to 2019. This was very important because now up to now it's almost 1 year after diagnosis, after detecting COVID. So we have about 1.5 million deaths. But Spanish flu, over about 2 years, they had 50 million deaths. That is, 1/3 of the world population was infected. So one major reason they believe now that there was that much high mortalities because of the lack of antibiotics. Antibiotics were discovered in 1929, and this was in 1918. So what about antibiotics in COVID? So there have been some studies on that. I think Amila will be talking about these things. So especially these procalcitonin. So procalcitonin levels are high, then we have to consider. And actually, what they believe, the world believe, is that antibiotics have probably saved thousands of lives in severely ill COVID patients, which was something that was not available during the Spanish flu season. So what about these patients once discharged? So this is mild to moderate pneumonia patients. So these are European guidelines. So they recommend to review these patients, mild to moderate patients, in 12 weeks. The reason being, there's a high risk of them developing pulmonary thromboembolism, pulmonary embolism, and also pulmonary vascular diseases and interstitial lung disease. So in the future, we might also be seeing this type of patients, and we might have to have follow-up clinics for these patients. So these patients, after 3 months of diagnosis or discharge, they recommend screen. And the severe patients, they recommend screen after 4 to 6 weeks of discharge. Again, for the same reasons: thromboembolism, pulmonary vascular diseases, and interstitial lung diseases. Okay, so that's about the pneumonias. So what about the cardiovascular risk? Uh, so we now know that cardiovascular complications can be very quite fatal, and we have seen a lot of patients who have died with MI and arrhythmias. So again, there are a lot of direct cardiomyopathy, cardiotoxicity by the viral toxicity, or it could be hypoxemia related, or it could be drug related or cytokine storms. Like there have been a lot of postulations why this happens. Ultimately, patients can develop acute coronary syndrome, arrhythmias, uh, myocarditis, and again thromboembolic disease. Acute MI, ischemic cardiac disease, which has been observed to have about 12%, and even that was noted during the Middle East respiratory syndrome. And arrhythmias can also be quite common, up to 7%. And cardiomyopathy, which could be direct toxicity or even could be due to stress-related cardiomyopathy. Again, with patients with cardiac symptoms, can do the cardiac markers, troponin, BNP, CRP, ferritin levels, interleukins. These things can be done to assess the prognosis, and imaging, all sort of cardiac imaging would be used. The kidneys also can get affected. Many patients with pneumonia can have asymptomatic rise in creatinine, and majority, about half of them, can have proteinuria. Quarter can have hematuria, and acute kidney injury is commonly seen in critical illness. So again, there have been a lot of postulations about the pathophysiology, sepsis, cytokine storm, direct cellular injury by the virus, and sometimes the drugs also can cause harm. Similarly, there can be several CNS manifestations, including toxic encephalopathy, viral encephalitis, and strokes as well. I'll be just touching on the so that's about the clinical syndromes mainly, but I think Amil has a full plate on management, so he wanted me to touch briefly on the oxygen, the respiratory management. So I'll just quickly go through this thing. So what about the hypoxic patient? So usually hypoxic patients are the patients with moderate disease, where patients have a respiratory rate more than 25 or 24, and a saturation less than 94. So these patients need oxygen and respiratory support. So our treatment options include conventional oxygen, high flow nasal cannula, positive pressure ventilation, or invasive mechanical ventilation. So these are from our national guidelines, which were published in March. So they say 92, but I think now they want to. I think it's many guidelines mention it as 94. So saturation less than 94, they might need some oxygen. So you can try with low flow oxygen with a nasal cannula or a venturi or a face mask. But if it is not responding, we have to upgrade for to the CPAP. So CPAP is in our guidelines, not in the American guidelines, but it is because it's more available here and because of our limitations. So CPAP, high flow, or NIV. So it should be the order should be the high flow first, high flow, CPAP, or other BiPAP or a non-invasive ventilation. So that is from the NIH or the American guidelines. You can see. So if the patient is not improving with oxygen, you can go for other therapies, which include high flow oxygen and BiPAP ventilation. Yeah, and here they also mentioned about prone positioning for patients with persistent hypoxemia despite increasing. So they are not responding to oxygen. They recommend a trial of awake prone positioning. However, that should not delay intubation in needy patients. So awake prone positioning has been in order to have a significant effect on their oxygenation. So what is awake prone positioning? So we ask the patient to self-prone themselves and keep on that in that position for a few hours. So that has been proved to improve the overall medial oxygen saturation. And there are several case series showing benefit of prone oxygen. And if you are staying for about 3 hours, that the arterial oxygen saturation can go up to 20%, go up by 20% in the blood gas. So who are the candidates? This prone position is recommended. The people who can independently stay in that position, who can tolerate lying, and even for pregnant patients that is acceptable, even a lateral decubitus position as you can see in this picture. But that is contraindicated in patients with respiratory distress or who need intubation, and patients with hemodynamical instability, and patients who had abdominal surgery or spinal injuries. High flow nasal cannula, high flow oxygen using high flow nasal cannula. These things are available now in most medical units and in most hospitals, which could be done in a HDU setting or even a ward setting. Patients, so this is using a high flow nasal cannula where the patients can still wear a surgical mask. So the staff treating this patient should be using the optimal protective equipment. Then CPAP, that is in Sri Lankan guidelines, we can use either a single tube or double lumen things, but what we have in the ICUs, which this is better double lumen. If you're using a single lumen one, you have to use a viral filter, or then you can use a non-invasive positive pressure ventilation within a vital machine if available. With that, stop. Thank you for your patient listening and hope you all are taking care of yourselves. Now the guidelines for clinical staff has been updated. If you have recently seen, now when you are doing your ward rounds, you are expected to have a eye coverage as well. So that's a recent update. So I hope you all have gone through that and update yourselves as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Suminda. I think they gave a comprehensive update on the clinical syndrome associated with the novel coronavirus infection. I think there comes the third presentation and the management of these patients. So Dr. Amir Rajapal is the respiratory physician of this hospital. I will going to talk on the current evidence, case management, and what is new, and all the newest information regarding the management of COVID-19. Amir.
Today.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizing committee for inviting me to present this about this COVID-19 management. In fact, it is a challenging task actually because so much of information is coming, it's updating day by day almost. And we were involving making a guideline initially about few months back, and now it has updated about few weeks back. But within these weeks, we have more information again coming. So I'd like try to kind of simplify this as much as possible to kind of not to make you confused. So I'll be using a lot of evidence-based practices, and I'm not using the newspaper alerts and everything. So these are all research-based updates. So remember, COVID-19 is an emerging and rapidly evolving situation. So it is evolving very rapidly, and therefore the management, the diagnosis, and investigation, everything is evolving. So you have to be updated at least once a week. You should read about news alerts and new articles on this COVID because it is rapidly evolving situation. I think the world has never seen this type of a virus before, as much as far as I know. Anyway, so this first I'm going to discuss about the overview, the disease categories, oxygenation. NIV has been dealt with, my colleague, and therapeutic management and about special situations. So remember, there are a large volume of data is coming. There are a large volume of publications. Please look at these publications before you come to a conclusion, because most of the publication we see as news alerts, some are fake news. And so try to kind of go for a peer-reviewed journal articles as your source of information, because I can, when you discuss with my colleagues, I can see most of people are talking about the news sellers. I mean, even though there's a recent vaccine is coming, but it's still is a news seller. It is not a peer-reviewed article on the vaccine. So therefore, you have to be very careful, because that you have to go through these very scientifically reviewed articles. Initially, we had this problem because we had a lot of information from China, and more than 50% of them were wrong actually. And now we know the real information. Right. So first, my before discussing about this management, my first advice is please avoid misinformation and disinformation, because that is also a pandemic at the moment. Right. So before I discuss about the management, I'd like to base my disease based on the disease severity categories. So this is a simple categorization, like mild, moderate, severe. I mean, I'm just using this in a practical way. Patients who are non-hospitalized or hospitalized, but who do not require any supplemental oxygen. This is the first category that we are talking about, maybe asymptomatics or very mildly symptomatic category. The second category is a patient who is admitted, hospitalized, but they require supplemental oxygen, but it is not in the form of high flow non-oxygenated oxygen, or it is not in forms of non-invasive ventilation. And the other group is actually patient who requires oxygen delivery through high flow nasal oxygen or through non-invasive ventilation. My last category is a critical group, where your patient requires additional support with invasive mechanical ventilation or ECMO. ECMO is not available. I mean, it is very limitedly available in Sri Lanka, but mainly it is a mechanical ventilation, invasive mechanical ventilation. So these are the categories I'm going to discuss. I try to be very simple and not to confuse you. So my first category is actually the patients who are not hospitalized, or patients are hospitalized but do not require supplemental oxygen. Each and every category we have objective. Remember, I mean, we are managing for a particular aim. We can't do so many things, but we have minimum aims. So the main aim of this category as clinicians to identify the high risk patients who will require additional support and who can progress to severe disease. There's a first objective. So when I was an asymptomatic patient or a minimal symptomatic patient is coming to most of the time into the intermediate centers, our first priority is to identify the high-risk patients who can progress, like patients with comorbid conditions, patients with pregnancy, immunosuppressed, or patients who are having elderly patients more than 65 years. These categories has to be identified very clearly as a first objective. The second objective is to be able to intervene to people who have tendency to fibrose to prevent their progression. So we have to identify these high risk categories, and then we should intervene to prevent their progression. That is our second objective when you are managing these patients who are in the intermediate centers. Right. For this management, I mean, unfortunately, we don't have any treatment at the moment for the patients who are mildly symptomatic or asymptomatic. To prevent disease progression, we don't have any FDA or any authority approved drugs at the moment. But remember, we have some hope. This is the newest drug which is coming to our practice, which is bamlanivimab, that is SARS-CoV-2 specific IgG. That is a specific immunoglobulin specific to SARS-CoV-2. And that is again based on a very limited study actually, that is called BLAZE-1 study. That is a phase 2 randomized control study. And that is to assess the safety and efficacy of this drug. And there is a specific immunoglobulin. I mean, I think you might know about chickenpox, right? In this varicella zoster. And in certain instances, we are giving immunoglobulins when they are very ill. And for example, like certain viral infections like rabies, we have used these immunoglobulins to prevent the syndrome. So this is like that. These are SARS-CoV-2 COVID-19 specific immunoglobulin, which is coming in a fashion. This has been immediately after this study, the FDA has given the emergency use authorization for this drug has to be used in selected crowds to prevent disease progression. Remember, this drug is not used in the severe category, not used in the complicated category. It is only used in a mildly or asymptomatic patient with risk factors who can progress into severe disease. And remember, in case by case basis, that remdesivir, which is antiviral, is used for Ebola, can be used to treat, but again, it is not approved for the time being, and the trials available, it has not studied among this group. But we have a very high risk patient who is having COVID. For example, like a patient with immunosuppression, we had several patients, interstitial lung disease, and on post-KT patients who died actually later, recently. And these patients are the people actually, before they come to severe category, we could have treated with these drugs to prevent their progression. So again, if you get all these patients, there's as my colleague Dr. Dumidas mentioned, that they have a risk of thrombosis. So we are talking with patients who have a clinical syndrome of respiratory disease and they have a high risk of thrombosis. So regarding starting antithrombotic treatment to this category, there is mildly symptomatic or asymptomatic. At the moment, there's no recommendation on even screening. So no point of even screening with all these D-dimers and troponins and everything. No point of screening for the time being because it is not evidence-based. And patients who are on antithrombotic drugs, I'm mainly talking about anticoagulation and antiplatelet drugs, should be continued without any restriction. So these patients who are on these drugs, either warfarin, heparin, or antiplatelet, should be continued. And then to initiate antithrombotic drugs, there's no evidence to initiate as per COVID per se to start these patients on aspirin or any other anticoagulation therapy. So if the patients develop a myocardial infarction or any thrombotic event only, we can initiate any drugs, but no point of starting these drugs prophylactically. And these are very kind of adjuvant therapies. I think we should know about these adjuvant therapies. So many people are on polypharmacy because of these adjuvant therapies. This vitamin C, D, and zinc, they are coming in a major. There are some studies published in NEJM that vitamin D deficiency is associated with COVID. But we couldn't find the other way that treating vitamin D deficiency might improve the outcome of COVID. We don't know about that. But for the time being, we know these things might help. So, example, if your patient is vitamin D deficient, definitely they should be on vitamin D and vitamin C again and zinc. There might be a place, but in desperate situations, you can try these as an adjuvant therapy. Evidence will come within about a month or two time because there are so many trials going on. But still, we can try if the patient is deteriorating and if we are thinking this patient is a high risk patient of developing severe COVID. And the next category is hospitalized patients who require supplemental oxygen. Again, we have a single objective to manage these patients. We should intervene these people to prevent their disease progression. Next stage, they might need high flow nasal oxygen, and they might need non-invasive ventilation, might need mechanical ventilation, might lead to thrombotic pain. So these patients, we have to intervene to prevent their progression. Again, if we discuss about the FDA approved drugs, yes, we have a single drug here that is your remdesivir. Remdesivir antiviral, which is used for Ebola, and it has been studied in two major clinical trials. One is called ACCT1. I'll discuss later about this trial. And that trial, they have shown there's a marginal benefit over mortality as well as duration of therapy. That the patient can be discharged early if you start this remdesivir drug. And this is proven in ACCT1, and there's a WHO funded study which has been, they are reported there's no much of benefit, but it has been not peer reviewed. But this study, ACCT1, which has been peer reviewed and published in NEJM, which they say there's a benefit, and WHO report is not peer reviewed. So in that case, we know there's some bias involved in the WHO study. But again, the benefit is not that significant. For example, if a patient with COVID without on placebo, they can be discharged in about 15 days, but these patients on remdesivir can be discharged in about 7 to 10 days. And again, there is so this is a study. There is a proven benefit there. And then in this group, whether these patients with remdesivir whether can be combined with dexamethasone, again that has to be discussed with the experts and has to be taken the decision case by case, because when the patient needs supplemental oxygen, you can use dexamethasone with combination of remdesivir, but there's no evidence for that. But we think when you combine remdesivir, and it will reduce the viral replication, therefore it will reduce the viral induced damage. But the dexamethasone is given for the virus induced cytokine storm. So when you reduce the virus load, we know that the cytokine storm further can be managed with combination of dexamethasone. These are based on expert view, so this can be combined together. And alone dexamethasone, again, it is not very beneficial when you given these patients who require supplemental oxygen. So I'll discuss about these studies later. And if you get antithrombotic therapies for this category, there is patients who require supplemental oxygen but do not require non-invasive ventilation or any high flow nasal cannula oxygen. So these groups that we have to screen these patients for coagulation problems. For example, like D-dimers or cardiac troponins can be commonly measured, but based on these measures, whether we should act on that, whether we should start antithrombotics or anticoagulants, we don't have much evidence, but still doing them in this category, I mean, it is not it is not contraindicated. You can do it, but again, based on these things, purely treating, you don't have much evidence for the time. And also, but there's a currently insufficient data recommend against routine DVT prophylaxis for these patients who are on oxygen therapy. If they can be mobilized, they do not require. But if they have a high thrombotic risk, for example, patient with a malignancy, patient who's obese, or pregnant lady having COVID requiring supplemental oxygen, we can consider DVT prophylaxis for these patients. So, and if these patients who develop a rapid deterioration in their pulmonary, cardiac, or neurological functions or sudden focal deficits, in that case, you have to case by case, you can consider starting antiplatelets and anticoagulation therapies. So, again, patients who are on antithrombotic drugs who require supplemental oxygen should be continued without any restriction. And the initiation of antithrombotic drugs, again, that starting thromboembolic prophylaxis is a standard care. That means who are having risk factors, we can consider starting VT prophylaxis. But patients who do not have risk factors apart from COVID, there's no indication. And also that again, patients who require any patient who has suspected to have any thromboembolic event, in this group, we can start these therapies. And this is the third group, the patient who require delivery of oxygen through a high flow device or non-invasive ventilation. And this category, again, we have one drug which is approved by the dexamethasone and it is studied in a recovery clinical trial. That is dexamethasone 6 milligram IV, orally, and we have to give 10 days or until the patient is discharged, whichever the earlier. That is trial is recovery. I'll discuss briefly about that study. And the experts actually they still think combining remdesivir and dexamethasone would be better rather than giving dexamethasone alone because you are reducing the inflammation plus reducing the viral load. So this is again the expert opinion, but there are no trials at the moment which has been combined remdesivir and the dexamethasone together. And again, actually, the doses that we have discussed as above, we have to use the remdesivir. It is not available in Sri Lanka for the time. And this is my last category of patients who require invasive mechanical ventilation or ECMO, which is limitedly available in our setup. The main objective that we have to consider is actually to prevent the mortality of this group. So we are just going to reduce the mortality. So again, if you go for the FDA-approved drugs, yes, we have dexamethasone, which is 6 milligram IV for 10 days so until the patient is discharged. And again, the experts believe that combining remdesivir and dexamethasone will be beneficial in this group, even though we don't have any evidence because we are reducing the viral load and the inflammation at the same time. Again, if you consider antithrombotic therapies, yes, we have to arrange coagulation parameters and we have coagulation screening. And there's again insufficient data to start routine antithrombotic therapies. And if the patient is having risk factors, we have to start VT prophylaxis. And patients with who is experiencing thrombotic event, again, yes, we have to start antithrombotic therapies. Again, we do not have much evidence for routine therapy for giving antiplatelets or anticoagulation for these patients. For example, we have a patient now who actually is in the intermediate unit, is on oxygen and NIV, non-invasive ventilation with COVID. And this patient developed a sudden shortness of breath with the SRT2-3T pattern. We are suspecting a thrombotic event and we are starting on enough. So in that situation, yes, we can consider start anticoagulation with antiplatelet therapy, but not as a prophylactic routine. We don't have any evidence for that. And I'm going to discuss very briefly about these emerging therapies. I mean, remdesivir is the only FDA-approved drug. The chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine was one of the in breakthrough news in paper articles and everything about few months back. But now we know it is multiple trials which is showing no benefit. And ivermectin again, it is an antiprotozoal drug. There's some benefit, and there's a study going doxycycline and ivermectin combination in patients with COVID-19. That is called a principal study. The study is going underway, and there are news alerts are coming, so that this combination is working. So that's why we are talking. This doxycycline might have some benefit when you start to these patients with COVID-19 pneumonia. And again, these antiretroviral drugs again proven by many trials that they are not working on this group. And if you are talking about immune-based therapies, the blood-based products, the convalescent plasma has been discussed significantly in the early part of this COVID pandemic. But now we know we don't have any trial evidence that there's any benefit of it. And again, now they have studied have pooled the blood-based antibodies together, non-specific COVID antibodies, and given to the patient. Still, we don't have any benefit from any studies. And you can use as a kind of a in emergency methods, but still we don't have any evidence. I mean, we have more than 10,000 has been studied with these products. We don't have much evidence on this convalescent plasma or pooled plasma, which is non-specific for COVID-19. But remember, this COVID-19 specific antibodies, it is coming in a major way to treat patients with mild condition to prevent their disease progression. And immunomodulators, we have steroids, you know, it works. And there are multiple immunomodulators, IL-6 inhibitors like tocilizumab, as alkyrin, and many other immunomodulators. Actually, that we know that for the time being, there are multiple trials going on, but for the time being, early data is not very suggestive of any benefit. So I'm going to discuss about the remdesivir because I think people should know about this study which is published in NEJM. And you can see this actually. The blue arm is the patients who are on remdesivir, and the red arm is the placebo arm. You can see actually the mortality wise there's no significant benefit, and again with the duration sometimes they come together. So the benefit is not that seems to be very significant in remdesivir. There's some benefit, but that is not very significant. And this, I think we should discuss about, we should read this article about dexamethasone is published in NEJM. It's a recovery trial that gives a very nice message. You can see the patients who are on, everybody actually there are some benefit, but patients who require oxygen and invasive ventilation, this red group is the placebo and the blue group is the dexamethasone. They improve the mortality significantly, about 28% improvement in the mortality. But if you give to the patients who are asymptomatic or mildly symptomatic, who do not require oxygen, look at this chart. So where the red one is up and the blue one is down. So what is going on? The patients have a high mortality once you give you routinely to the COVID patients. So don't give steroids to your COVID patients unless they are in a cytokine storm situation. That is, they're requiring oxygen. That is, they are having ARDS. But don't give steroids to patients who are having mild or asymptomatic COVID just to prevent the disease, right? This is going to increase their mortality. So this is a very nice information they have given us from this trial. So even though we have dexamethasone or plenty of dexamethasone, don't use it haphazardly and routinely. That will increase the mortality of our patients if we use kind of due to anxiety, right? So don't use to the mild or minimal symptomatic patients. And I'll discuss about three populations: the pregnancy, children, and influenza. Children has been dealt with by my colleague Dominder. Pregnancy again is very important because once the pregnant patient found, that we have to transfer this patient to the current evidence that we have transferred to IDH or level 2 care. But again, that we might get a patients who are in this kind of pregnant lady to our hospital who is in term for delivery, or who might with other complications. We might get these patients very soon. So therefore, actually, we should separate, not treat other COVID patients. There should be a separate facility to keep these high-risk patients like pregnant ladies apart from the other COVID patients, because we need to monitor their fetal and maternal monitoring is very important, because even the fetus can get complication with COVID. So therefore, there should be a fetal and maternal complication monitoring should be kind of happening. For example, in our hospital, that we have recognized ward 1 and 2 for these kind of pregnant ladies, and they should be vigilant monitoring in a separate unit. And I think timely interventions are important if the patient, if there's either fetal distress or maternal distress, we'll discuss with our genetics colleagues regarding a safe delivery. And children, again, I think it's most of the things are dealt with. The mortality is low, however, they have a high morbidity. And 12% in US actually, children are affected with this virus. And we have, my colleague discussed about this Kawasaki-like syndrome, which carries a mortality, which is multisystem inflammatory syndrome. The most important thing I'm going to discuss about influenza. Remember, influenza, now all the guidelines and all the experts do recommend having influenza vaccine. If I ask you to hand up who had influenza vaccine this year, I mean, nobody, right? Amazing. So this is the evidence-based practice. I mean, everybody, every patient and every healthcare worker, especially who are facing this COVID, is mandated to have the influenza vaccine. So please do have your vaccine, because now we know it's a co-infection coming with the with this epidemic scenario. I mean, with this in Sri Lanka, we have from December to March, we have one epidemic is coming with influenza. We know it's as a co-infection. So therefore, this vaccination, which is available for influenza, which might not be the 100% cover, but still it is recommended that we should have to have this vaccine. And other things, actually, when there's a COVID patient coming with symptoms, irrespective of their influenza status, we should start this patient on oseltamivir until we are getting the report negative. So until we get some kind of conclusive evidence or like nasal swab sampling saying it is negative, we should start oseltamivir on these patients with COVID-19 when they're coming in the season. So this is a seasonal influenza. For example, we have Rohita, we have our season coming now. And this season, when a patient coming with COVID and when they are symptomatic, irrespective of their influenza status, this patient should be on oseltamivir. And later we can prove it is negative. But the problem is we have a limitation on doing influenza these days because our lab is fully functional for COVID, and their capacity is not there to test for influenza at the moment. Am I correct, Roy? Yeah, so they don't have the capacity to do influenza. So what I suggest is actually, I think there's no harm. I mean, patient is symptomatic with COVID, please consider starting oseltamivir. But as I think we should be ready with the vaccine. And thank you so much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much. The updated knowledge on the evidence base, and these are the latest information. As you mentioned, some of this data is actually available for last within 1 week. It's neutralizing antibody against this one, the binding protein. Now, I just want to, before we come to this question time, the Sri Lanka College of Pulmonology, with participation of all my colleagues, we have prepared a comprehensive guideline on COVID. And I handed over some of this COVID and the director and all, because it is addressing each and every steps of COVID as well as the comorbidities and things. Now, in the last 1 month, we have updated the guideline. We are going to publish very soon, about 1 or 2 days time. And particularly this, the new thing what Amila mentioned, the influenza and things, these are the latest information, are all included into this new guideline. And we can, if you have requested, I may be able to give you soft copy in 2 days time. Hard copies for the previous one, I had it to most of you, consulting as well as the biological microbiologist. And everything was included in the guideline prepared by our own college. I'm inviting all 3 speakers to the table, and we will open the discussion and question time. Nelson, can I have this light on? So if there are any question, please can ask if there any doubt or anything, any queries related to this lectures.
Hello. Can I ask a question? I'm online.
So any question, please ask, because it's high time. To clarify the most of the thing, I'm very happy that as a case, and we have address the most important information, what is needed to know by the all doctors in the country. And these three lectures are actually telecast in several other places in Canada and other hospitals because this information are very, very important. You are listening to the expert, but not to the non-expert appearing on the TV and the print and other media. They are non-expert. So yes, this was very important. This and any questions related to this lecture?